Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. And welcome to this webinar from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Today, we will be discussing the world economy after the US elections, and we have a lot to discuss. We have, of course, the next US administration's economic and trade policy, as we know so far, the pandemic, China's next 5-year plan, the World Trade Organization, and a host of other topics besides. To discuss these topics, we have on our panel today Robert Ward, who is Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the IISS, and also the Japan Chair, Dr. David Gordon, who is Senior Advisor to the Geoeconomics and Strategy Program, and Dr. Irene, who is the Senior Fellow for Latin America and Editor of the Armed Conflict Survey. We're going to have this as quite a conversational format, and we're going to discuss this, or we'll try and get through as much of this wide-ranging discussion as we can. If you want to ask questions during the webinar, please feel free to do so. You can type questions while we're talking, and we will pick up on some of them as we go, and we'll tackle them in bulk towards the end. If you want to ask a question in a written format, then click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type your question. But after about 45 minutes, we'll also pick any raised hands. So if you would like to ask your question vocally, orally, as such, then you can raise your hand and we will call on you. We will unmute your microphone, but please make sure you unmute yourself as well. We'll then call on you. Please ask your question succinctly, state who you are and where you're from, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. So we have a lot to discuss, so I think we'll begin. And it's hard to begin with anything other than the US election. We had a IISS event last week, which addressed the implications for US foreign policy generally. So we'll talk specifically about economic and trade policy and geoeconomics. So first of all, David, what do you expect from the Biden administration's economic and international trade policy, and how do you expect this to shape the US's economic relations with the rest of the world over the next 4 years?
Great, thank you very much. Let me be as succinct as I can, and we can go on afterwards on some of the points I've made. So I think there are 4 categories here. Technology, trade, international finance, and climate. And let me go through those. On technology, I think there's going to be a lot of continuity between the themes of the Biden administration and what President Trump has been doing, particularly in the last 2 years, in terms of challenging China and the role of Chinese firms, particularly in third markets. So I think on tech continuity, I think that the big difference will be that the Biden administration is likely to seek out much more forcefully alliances, multilateral alliances in doing so. On trade, I think here is where there's quite a bit of uncertainty. I think that the Biden administration will inherit a wide range of tariffs. Biden talked about the possibility of unilateral lifting of tariffs. I think there may be a little bit of that, but I don't believe that there'll be widespread unilateral lifting of tariffs. So I do think that the Biden administration will seek to engage China on a very broad-based trade negotiation. More generally, as is the case with tech, I think that on trade, the US will seek to work more with its European and Asian allies in putting together a common trade front against China. And so I think that, again, the alliance theme is up, and there will definitely be a very sharp break from the Trump administration's push on tough trade policy against US allies. I don't expect any of that. On international finance, I think that one of the very interesting questions here will be, might a Biden administration take a more generous view towards the creation of SDR and allocation of SDRs as a way to increase access by poor countries to increase liquidity in the context of the continuing recession driven by COVID.
David, can you just explain to some of our audience what SDRs are?
Yeah, so these are a special drawing rights. It's a partial form of currency that is not connected to any individual state, but would be done under the auspices of the International Monetary Fund. And so it's a way to increase global liquidity without requiring capital infusions from particular countries. And it's been fairly controversial historically. It's a pretty technical issue. The Trump administration was quite negative, as has the US been historically. But there may be more room here in a new Biden administration. And finally, I do think that there will be an increased interest in the US, the newly created US Development Finance Corporation, working with other non-Chinese DFCs to create greater alternatives to Chinese financing of large infrastructure projects, as they're doing in their Belt and Road Initiative. So that's the, finally on climate, yeah, so that's the big challenge here, because I think on the one hand, President Biden will immediately rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. But if, as is overwhelmingly likely, the Republicans continue to hold a majority in the Senate, it's really not going to be politically viable to do anything like what Biden had been talking about during the campaign in his light version of the so-called Green New Deal. None of that has any political viability now. So I think expectations in the rest of the world of a sharp shift in US actual policy on climate are probably not warranted, although the tone will be completely different.
Thank you, David. Irene, the issuance of special drawing rights would be really significant for a lot of developing countries. So far as you're concerned, is there anything particular to look out for in the Biden administration's policy towards emerging markets in general, and perhaps especially to Latin America?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I was really looking at Biden possible move on Latin America, and I agree with actually David landscape on those different issues. I think also for Latin America there will be some changes more in rhetoric rather than really in substance. Of course, the region is going to have to deal with a much more informed and sympathetic counterpart. And I think in general, the emerging market. What I would say is that probably what we see in terms of trade and economic policy towards the region and also in general emerging market have to do with the fact that if we look at trade in general in the US and the approach to trade of the two different parties, of course, Trump was a bit of an anomaly because, as we know, Republicans were really always in favor of free trade and big corporations. So Biden, I think, will have to, he won't change substantially the approach in terms of towards a more free trade world. Of course, as David said, it's going to be much more multilateral approach for sure, and also much more sophisticated in the sense that it's probably not going to be based on trade tariff, particularly as Trump used to do, right? It's going to be probably use other type of economic statecraft that the US has at its disposal, including, as David mentioned, really looking at way to support investment and to use the different institutions, including the Import-Export Bank, to really, if you look at Latin America, probably also to counterbalance a little bit the inroads that China has done in terms of infrastructure, which is going to be one of the key issue, I guess, in the US, but also in the rest of the world. The other thing I think it's important to mention is that to make really free trade or freer trade more applicable by the constituencies that actually supported Biden, including trade unions and other constituencies, is going to be important to show that trade is going to benefit the worker and the domestic economic recovery. So, and this is actually quite interesting because if you look at Latin America, the main trade agreement which bind the US with Central America and Mexico, the USMCA, which was obviously renegotiated by the Trump administration, is an agreement where there are quite a lot of regulation in terms of labor rights and environmental standards. So I think there again, I would expect Biden actually to focus on those elements, which would be also important to level the playing field in a way with respect to internal constituency and internal worker. So as I said, I don't expect as there much difference in substance, but different approach and probably a much more sophisticated approach.
Thinking of a slightly different region of the world, is there any prospect of the US administration, of the Biden administration, re-engaging with CPTPP, do you think, David or Robert?
So,
Robert, yeah.
Robert, why don't you go?
Okay. So, I mean, Biden starts out his administration with a great deal of goodwill. A lot of countries will be internationally. A lot of countries will be sort of relieved that the tone of engagement will change. But I'd caution against sort of being seduced by the mellifluousness, comparatively, in comparison to Trump, obviously, of Biden's rhetoric. You know, he has an important domestic base to tend to, particularly in the Rust Belt, which, as we know, caused quite a lot of uncertainty in the election itself. So he will be constantly looking to bolster his base. He will be constantly looking to sort out the domestic economy, and obviously the priority there is COVID, but also unemployment benefit, infrastructure investment, and so on. And you just have to look at his transition website, Build Back Better, to see that the focus will inevitably be on the domestic economy. So with regard to the CPTPP, I suspect that he will make some positive announcements or positive noise around CPTPP, but I cannot see the US just being willing under Biden just to sort of slip back into the existing agreement. I think they'll have to extract, if they wanted to, if Biden wants the US to come in again, he will have to be seen to extract some concessions. And of course, the last thing the existing TPP countries want is another negotiation. This was an incredible thing to keep going after Trump withdrew the US. There's a lot of countries, a lot of interests at stake. So the last thing the countries that are in the CPTPP will want is another round of negotiations. So there'll be a definite change in tone, more mellifluous, sort of nicer if you're a fan of the multilateral order. But don't mistake that for a sort of return to the world of 2008 to 2016, because I think that world has definitely gone.
Just one last comment on this, Nick, because I basically agree with what Robert said, but I think the challenge here for the Biden administration, if you talk to Biden's advisors, none of them are talking about getting back into CPTPP. On the other hand, the logic of re-engaging and reassuring allies, I think, is going to put some pressure over time to do this. And then you get into the trade-offs that Robert is talking about, because if you start paying more attention to what Japan wants, what the Southeast Asian nations want, et cetera, and a more multilateral approach, they're very keen on CPTPP. So I think that's going to be the challenge here, because I do think the strategic logic of building a large coalition, geoeconomic coalition to balance China does lead you in the direction of CPTPP.
And the other, if I may just sort of code it to what David said, the other point about the countries that are in the CPTPP, of course, is that they want a predictable America. So if there's a US in the CPTPP, they want to have a sort of a sense that this is going to be a predictable entity in the organization. So I think it's, as David's sort of suggesting, I think it's sort of early days, even though the strategic imperative is definitely in favor of the US being part of the club.
Well, you mentioned China, and you've also already mentioned that the Biden administration it looks unlikely to unilaterally lift tariffs quickly or to a significant extent. Does that hold? That particularly holds, I guess, for China and the US-China trade war. That niceness in international relations that Robert spoke about, how much do you expect to see that play out in the US-China trade war? David, what do you expect going forwards?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the areas in which a Biden administration will want to engage China. So I think they're going to be quite tough on technology, but on trade, I think they're going to seek a negotiation which will be quite expansive and comprehensive. Now, it takes two to tango, and what the Chinese view of this is going to be is really uncertain. So, I mean, the big shift here in recent Chinese thinking is the changing characterization of the international context. For decades, the Chinese have believed that the international context has been broadly favorable for their continued growth and development. But in the last year or so, you now have a view that's expressed at the very top in China that the international context is becoming much more challenging for China, and that's the backdrop for this move by China to try to become more domestically focused. So I'm frankly not sure how China will respond to this initiative, and there's a parallel here to the early days of the Obama administration, in which Obama came in, there was already a pretty good relationship between the US and China developed at the end of the George W. Bush administration. Obama came in thinking that he could really expand that. So in trade, again, there's been a reasonable relationship between USTR and their Chinese counterparts. And I think the Biden team will again come in believing that they can expand that. But just as what happened when Obama tried, he did not find a willing partner on the Chinese side. Not clear to me that Biden is going to find a willing partner on the Chinese side.
And you speak of the Biden administration wanting to put a comprehensive range of issues on the table for negotiation with China. Is there anything in particular you think they're likely to want to negotiate that wasn't really discussed during the Trump administration? Or is it likely to look similar?
No, I think the themes are quite similar.
Yeah. And Robert, perhaps a little bit on the health of the Chinese economy. SMEs in China are struggling. Consumption looks sluggish. Domestic debt is about 317% of GDP. So on the surface, China's economy looks okay. It's continuing to grow this year despite the pandemic. Underneath the surface, how does it look?
So, I mean, China obviously started the year badly. He's going to end this, the recovery is underway. And you can see by all these various sort of bank holidays and so on, all the people getting together. I mean, it's sitting in Europe. It's unbelievably extraordinary what they're doing as we're all sitting here, sort of socially distanced in the UK and elsewhere. And China will be one of the only countries in the world that will actually, any large countries anyway, that will actually be growing this year. And into next year, I'm looking at forecasts, and I'm seeing forecasts for GDP growth 2021, about 7%, 8%. So this, of course, is partly rebound from the poor result this year, but still, in comparison to the rest of the world, is doing pretty well. There's a lot of excitement, of course, now because China's doing better than everywhere else, particularly in China, about China will accelerate its overtaking of the US economy at some point as the largest economy in the world. And there's quite a lot of sort of huffing and sort of chest pumping in China as a result of this. I saw a report the other day, some Chinese government official was talking about China achieving GDP growth of 5% a year for every year until 2035, which would be, be a minor miracle if they actually achieved that. And it's not necessarily clear to me that it's even good for the economy to be growing at that flat out rate for that long, given that the economy is maturing. I would always caution about China, having looked at Japan for a long time and experienced the hubris in the 1980s, which was then replaced by something rather grim in the 1990s, that these economies that think they look pretty well, if they've got the structural weaknesses sitting under them, they will eventually start to pull growth down quite significantly. And of course, in China, you have, just like you had in Japan in the 1980s, you have enormous debt problem, as you said, Nick, and nearly 320% of GDP equivalent. That for a country of China's development level, that is a very high ratio indeed. You have a property market that's on fire at the moment, and some of these debt figures for these property developers are eye-poppingly enormous. The gap between 2010 and 2020 is in the order of tens of billions. Some of these individual companies, quite extraordinary. Plus, of course, you've got the demographic issues. China is having even fewer babies born than it ever has since the 1960s, I think, despite the relaxation of the one-child policy. So China, and of course, you've got the productivity issue there too. So China has many things to deal with. So it's not necessarily clear to me that even though China is going to have a decent year this year relatively, and a good year next year relatively, that this sets it on a path to what Xi Jinping and other policymakers are expecting. Lots of problems there.
Before we move on to some other regions of the world, I want to pick up on a couple of questions that have been asked already. One for you, David. How do you reconcile the idea of a more domestically focused China with the Belt and Road Initiative. How will the BRI change in response? And then I have a question, which I'll direct, I think, at Robert, which is, the Trump administration reflected a wider disillusionment with globalization, perhaps heightened by the global pandemic. Is there any sense that this is going away? And how will that affect or hamstring the Biden administration? But firstly, David, on the BRI.
Yeah, so I think that what we've seen really in the last year and a half, so predating COVID, has been BRI entering into a period of consolidation, if not slowdown. So I do think that the days of just pouring monies into these projects and provincial governments and city governments in China and SOEs being able to take huge advantage of this wall of money being given to BRI, that looks to me as if it's in the past. I think that what we are seeing is that in practice, BRI is becoming more focused on technology issues, the so-called digital Silk Road, which is much more dependent on Chinese private companies and the best Chinese private companies. So I don't think we're at the end of BRI, but we certainly are at the end of the beginning of BRI.
David, sorry, Robert, globalization and malaise.
Yes, and it's important to remember this didn't just start with the pandemic. I mean, this actually, even though the great financial crisis of 08, 09, financial economic crisis was a watershed, actually the disillusionment with globalization had set in, I suspect, in the early 2000s. Jobs were being created, but lower paying, median wages, average wages stagnated even before the great financial crisis. This has been a slow burn thing that that sort of obviously exploded with the financial crisis, and then has been sort of catalyzed, that disillusionment catalyzed potentially by the pandemic. The problem is for Biden that globalization doesn't necessarily bring jobs home, and one of his tasks is to create more jobs, better paying jobs domestically. He's going to focus on the middle classes in America, on the sort of lower paid people as well. And this, globalization is difficult to paint a sort of positive picture politically for globalization with all this sort of domestic policy priorities that of course he has. So I think the globalization, I mean, its death has been overdone, overplayed many times, but certainly globalization has plateaued. And I think I suspect we'll be talking about the WTO a bit later. But there's a real, I think, incumbent on policymakers, on multilateral institutions, on domestic policymakers everywhere, to try to perhaps rethink what globalization looks like, with a view on the rise of the populace, the sort of discontent with low wage rises, the kind of jobs that are being created because the best jobs have left for other countries and so on. I think that's going to be one of the key subjects, if you like, of the next few years in the US and of course elsewhere as well.
If I can add just on this point, Nick, I think there's also some causes for hope, because in a way I think the pandemic has also showed that governments which have been more competent in dealing with pandemic are probably the ones that are going to be, and that have been already actually winning at election and also in polls across the world. The fact itself that Biden has won probably has to do a little bit with that, more with the incompetence of Trump, but nevertheless. And I guess the issue, to Robert's point, it's really how do we make sure that all those causes for frustration before the pandemic are going to be addressed in some way, and in a way, it's going to be harder because obviously the situation, the macroeconomic situation of most countries is going to be much worse than before the pandemic in a way. So I guess the issue is really to look at ways to make sure that growth becomes more sustainable and more inclusive. And that's what we've seen in Latin America, but also across the world, across emerging markets. All those frustration and discontent with respect to the way in which the growth model and the development model have been played out in the past decades, I think are still there and are going to be even greater after the pandemic. But I think it is a good opportunity really to rethink and about what should be the best model in that respect. So really take the pandemic and take this dissatisfaction with the status quo as a way to really think deeply on what could be done and which kind of drivers for sustainable growth we can work on together. And the US, I think, will have a fundamental role in really leading and facilitating this kind of conversation and policy options across the world.
And do you have a sense of the ways in which governments might attempt to achieve that? Yeah, I mean, if I look at Latin America, which also is my region of focus, there have been quite a lot of conversation spearheaded by ECLAC, which is the UN Commission for Latin America, but also lots of academics and different institutions on what could be a way to really address the weaknesses that the pandemic has highlighted in the current model of development, which fundamentally really have to do with the inequality, with the fact that there is a really a sustainable base for growth, in the sense that what we have seen in most emerging countries is really that even the lockdown measures and the way in which government were trying to address the pandemic and limit the contagion were impossible, just because we have a situation in which a large part of the labor market is informal, so people really don't have the luxury to stay at home or to be in a lockdown. You also have a situation in which there is no access to social nets for a big majority of the population. You have a problem of unequal access to healthcare, to education, and all those concerns actually, which were top of the agenda of the protests in Latin America, but also across the world in the past decade in many emerging markets. So what we heard a lot in the region is really looking at how do we kickstart growth, but how do we make sure that this growth is more inclusive, and actually looking at factors of inclusivity more as a factor of competitiveness as well. So basically the idea is that growth to be actually sustainable needs to be inclusive, and this is actually not because it's something good to do, but it's because it's something that ensures long-term growth and competitiveness of an economy. So, and related to that, obviously consideration of green growth. So how do we actually make growth more sustainable from an environmental point of view? And obviously technology is very important, but I think the conversation is still starting. I think the world we really have to address those kind of issues, because things are not going to get any better. And as I said, any time when actually the situation is very tragic, there is the incentive to do something to make it better. So I think in that sense, I'm optimistic that there will be some move in that sense in really finding new drivers for growth. Well, as you mentioned, Latin America is one region that has been hit quite hard by the pandemic. Another one hit very hard is Europe. And David, I know you're concerned about the economic troubles facing Europe.
So I do think that 2020 was in some ways has been a historic year in terms of cooperation in Europe, with the agreement reached on the massive support fund. But I think that as we look now at the context in Europe, with the pandemic really hitting just incredible proportions. I look at the numbers in France, and they're they're really astonishing. And Belgium, Netherlands. So I think the chance of a double dip recession in Europe are quite high now. And I think one of the impacts of a double dip recession will mean that what was originally seen as a fund targeted at Spain, Italy, Southern European countries, Southeastern European countries, there's now going to be a much longer queue for these resources. And I think that will be a challenging possibility. And secondly, I'm concerned about the potential for a leadership vacuum in Europe as the German election dynamics come into play in the early months of next year. And I'm not worried about Germany. Germany's going to be fine, but this election is likely to be pretty intense with some new coalitions. I think the most likely coalition is a coalition between the CDU, CSU, and the Greens. That's not going to be easy to put together. That will be overwhelmingly focused on the domestic side. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Angela Merkel has been right at the center of all successful efforts in Europe at crisis management for well over a decade. And I think that you take away, Merkel's been sort of this public good for Europe that you don't appreciate until it's gone. And she will be gone pretty soon. So I think 2021 looks to me to be a challenging year. But the good news here, the one piece of good news is I think the positive evidence that we're seeing on the vaccine front, it will create a notion that perhaps it's only the next 6 months that we really have to be in crisis mode and then can come back out of it. That will be positive for countries being willing to continue high levels of fiscal support if they see an end to this. I think if there's not an end in sight, which is what it looked like even a couple of weeks ago, that would have been a much more challenging environment. So I put a great deal of significance on recent developments on the vaccine front, although realistically, in terms of economic impact, it's at least 6 months down the line.
Can I just add to David's point, Nick? I think in Europe, EU, there's a sort of distinct whiff of Japanification in Europe at the moment. So low, over the next few years, low interest rates, zero interest rates, very low growth, and of course, very high debt as well. And okay, Europe and Japan, they are EU, Japan, quite different in so many ways. But I think the Europeans are going to be, and of course the UK as well, are going to be struggling again with this quite so intensely different economic backdrop. At the same time, I think as Irene has been, as Irene was saying, of trying to create more jobs, trying to look to domestic stability, trying to stop populism in some countries, and so on. So the Japanification, I think, of Europe is going to be something that we'll probably be talking about a bit more in coming years.
Yeah, and you mentioned a distinctly different economic backdrop. And I wonder, this seems to raise some questions about the government's role in the economy. The pandemic itself has raised questions about the government's role in the economy. They're intervening a lot more than they're used to doing. And there are also some long-term factors in this too, it seems. Companies in the West are having to compete with Chinese companies that are subsidized by the state. We're worried about China dominating certain technologies, which has raised questions about whether Western governments should help to create competitors. And the pandemic is an interesting moment, it seems. In 1982, Milton Friedman wrote that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And there are a lot of ideas lying around right now about government intervention in the economy. So do you think we are now seeing governments rethinking their economic policies and their role and picking up on some of these ideas, or is it really just a case of they're muddling through right now?
Is that for me, Nick?
Let's start with you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the landscape, gosh, how quickly everything's changed. 2019 to now. I mean, at the end of 2020, governments everywhere will be in control of great swathes of their economies. It takes, in the UK, it sort of feels a bit like the 1970s, where you could live every bit of your life without touching the private sector at all. So, this is a sort of post. There's a feel of the post after the Second World War about it as well, where the government just needed to take over to support, to keep things going. And so its role obviously increased hugely. To your point about is this planning and so on, of course, at the moment it's reactive. They're just trying to keep the economies on the road and companies and keep people employed and so on. But this government, the sort of size of the government's role in the economies, I mean, it is going to be an absolutely huge issue for how you run an economy. You think about competition policy, think about employment policy, think about the so how do you nurture new industries when so much of the economy is just propped up by the government and so on. And then, of course, to your point, Nick, about authoritarian capitalism, this is again, I mean, this new debate comes hot on the heels of the existing debate, Western capitalism versus authoritarian capitalism. So at the moment, governments everywhere, as far as I can work out, certainly in the West, are being reactive about this. Obviously, once the dust starts to clear, things will become, the debate will really hot up. How much of the economy can you return to the private sector? How do you do that while keeping jobs while keeping job numbers high and so on? So employment high rather, or up. So a big issue. And then, of course, sort of related to that is the issue of how governments try to normalize, whatever normalization means now, their debt positions too. So how do you square all of this with what inevitably look to me like innovative measures of getting money from consumers and businesses, so higher taxes ultimately?
So, but there are also, as I say, some long-term trends towards it. I mean, Mariana Mazzucato is one of the people who has advocated for a slightly more interventionist state in the economy. And in fact, she has started advising the Italian government recently. So Irene, I can't resist directing this question at you, therefore. Does the Italian government buy this? Do you think governments are buying this bigger interventionist role for the state, an entrepreneurial state?
So I think, to be honest, that's a kind of a perennial debate, right? Whether the state should be involved or whether the state should champion some of or plan the economy in a way to ensure the most optimal competitive setting. To be honest, I think the answer is always the same, at least to me. I think there is, as Robert said, there are spaces in which the government could definitely intervene. I think especially now, after the pandemic, with limited resources, there is definitely a role to play in financing innovation, in maybe investing more in R&D, education, of course, the type of education which is conducive to the need of the private sector. I think the trick is always how the government does that, right? So the best way to do it would be to do it in a market-friendly way. So actually invest and intervene whenever is needed, and then let the market actually do play. Once the market is ready, the market should take over. And it's actually something that I remember many years ago. I wrote a case studies on Israel, and how Israel actually had spearheaded the growth of the tech sector from practically scratch. So I think it's one of the few cases in which actually the government intervened in a very good and market-friendly and efficient way. I think the challenge is to do that, because obviously it's not easy, and especially when you look at developing countries where the government effectiveness is not as high, where there are issues of really governance and more in general efficiency and capabilities of the government, it's a problem. That being said, I think there is definitely there's definitely the case for looking at how the government could work with the private sector in a more synergetic way in order to achieve better foundation for growth. As usual, the devil is in the details, right? Because it's not easy to do. But definitely, I think it's a debate that it won't stop now. If anything, is going to become even more important going forward.
Just a brief comment on this. So I was quite struck yesterday when I picked up my Financial Times and I saw the piece by Stephanie Griffith-Jones, whom I remember when I used to do a lot of work in Africa 35 years ago. She was a colleague calling for the creation of a public investment bank in the United States. And I thought, oh my God, no. So there's not going to be the creation of a publicly owned investment bank in the United States, but these ideas, I think you are having this big debate. The election of Joe Biden in the US was this interesting coming together of people who were calling for a return to the pre-Trump normalcy, and those who were calling for accelerating the pace of change. And this is going to be an exceptional challenge for Biden to manage. In my view, he's actually going to be helped in this by the fact that the likelihood that Republicans are going to control the Senate means that nothing very dramatic in terms of big institutional changes like that can really be on the agenda, nor will a Republican Senate confirm Elizabeth Warren as Secretary of the Treasury or anything like that. But I think that Irene and Robert are right, that these changes are rife. And it's really interesting to me. You now have a development economist as the head of the IMF. Kristalina Georgieva is very different from all of the prior heads of the International Monetary Fund. The only thing she has in common is that she's a European. So these debates have gone right into the most significant international financial institutions in the world.
Well, speaking of another international institution, the World Trade Organization. For the past few years, the WTO has been pretty well crippled by the United States. And in fact, more recently, the US blocked the consensus of almost all other member states on appointing Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the new Secretary General. David, under the new US administration, well, firstly, what do you think will happen with the appointment process for the Secretary General? And secondly, is there any hope of a more functional World Trade Organization?
So I do think we're going to get the first African head of the WTO. That would be my strong bet here. In terms of the WTO, I think the U.S. That policy under a Biden administration will be much more favorable to sustaining the judicial function of the WTO. I don't think that I believe that the era of the WTO as a major player in trade negotiations, these big global rounds, I think that's probably a thing of the past. So I do think that the Biden administration will have a very different view on the juridical piece of this, but I think that the role of the WTO as a motivator of trade liberalization, of trade negotiations, I suspect that will not be recreated.
So your expectation is that instead trade negotiations will be dominated by bilateral and regional negotiations,
yes.
or do you see
yes, exactly.
20
yes.
or another mile? Okay.
No. Bilateral, regional, absolutely.
Okay.
Can I
also on international trade, the pandemic has highlighted some vulnerabilities in global supply chains, whether that's for chemicals, medical equipment, microprocessors, fertilizers, or various goods. I mean, it's highlighted both the points of failure in the global supply chains and also the downside of cutting costs by cutting back on inventory. And there's also a lot of political pressure to move manufacturing out of China. Japan, for example, is pursuing its China +1 policy. But for businesses that need to keep costs low, none of this is very easy. So, Robert, first, I wonder what changes are we really likely to see from businesses and governments in terms of supply chain risks and management going forward?
If I could just, before I answer that one, Nick, as a coda to what David has just said about the global trading system, I think the way I see it with the looming Biden administration, the global trading system moves from a kind of an acute state to a chronic state, back to a chronic state. So I think we shouldn't kid ourselves that everything was sunny uplands before Trump, because we talked about globalization, and that's got deep roots back decades. Not, I think, quite similar for the global trading system. And the WTO, much as of course we all need it as a policeman for the global system. I mean, there are issues there that the new DG will need to address. One is how it deals with China, and its dealing with China over the years has been problematic, I would say. Another one is how it deals with the growing rise in digital trade throughout the world. So there's a lot of reforms that actually do need to happen in the WTO, notwithstanding the support that most countries have or often have for it because of its role in the multilateral system. So from acute, I think, to chronic, but that obviously means that there's still plenty of things that need to be sorted out. And I think the best guarantee for the WTO would actually be if Biden can be successful with his domestic agenda. So if he can produce jobs at home and he can get wages up and he can get support domestically in the US back for the multilateral system, I think that would be a tremendous sort of boon for the WTO. To your second point, Nick, on decoupling, I think you're getting it, sort of decoupling. I don't see again that Biden is going to reverse the decoupling trend that we've had over the past few years. I think this is pretty much set, particularly as I think David was saying, in strategically important areas such as tech, also in newly strategically important areas such as healthcare, food security. I think will also be important. So supply chains in some areas will continue to shorten. I still, and if anyone out there can show me where on the planet there exists another China, I'd be very happy to know where it is, because there is no alternative to China. India doesn't come anywhere close, not in terms of infrastructure, in terms of wealth, in terms of what it can offer MNCs and so on. So they're really, despite this decoupling that will happen in certain areas, I think the size of the Chinese market, what China offers companies, I think that is really quite difficult to beat. So I don't see decoupling being a complete bifurcation of the global economic system. Companies may have to work out a way of serving the West and serving China that gets them around the various barriers that will be thrown up. But China definitely will be part of the supply chains in many industries going forward. Difficult to get around that. Japan, I think, as you said, has been offering subsidies to companies to move production out of China. I see that as part of a continuation of their China +1 strategy, which has been going on for predates Trump even, and this has been going on a long time. It's part of an effort to de-risk supply chains, but it won't shift all of Japanese manufacturing out of China, because that's just not possible.
If I can add to that, because obviously one of the opportunity of the pandemic and the regionalization of supply chain for the Americas, we guess, is that Mexico, and going through the Mexico trade link with the Pacific Alliance could be actually a possible new supply chain for the. I mean, Mexico, it is already to a certain extent an alternative supply chain. I do agree with Robert. There is going to be some regionalization of the supply chain, especially for essentials. So food is probably in the top, but also essential manufacturing. And so I think that there is an opportunity there for Central America and I would say Pacific, Latin America to play a role. I think, of course, there are lots of issues there. There is there is an issue of infrastructure, issue of geography as well, which has prevented for many years Latin America to act as one. And obviously, there are different issues in terms of capabilities and cost competitiveness. I do think there is an opportunity. I do think that it's an opportunity at the same time, which doesn't mean that China is not involved, because I suspect that China will be able to invest in most of those new supply chains, given that it's probably the country which still has quite a lot of money to invest. Latin America is obviously one of the regions in which China has done quite a lot of inroads in the past few years, also thanks to the US disengagement in the region. I think at the end of the day, also this idea of also decoupling and a regionalized supply chain really depend also on the impact of the pandemic and how much this will be felt in the next few years, and the impact needs to be big enough for people to actually do the investment to regionalize the supply chain. So of course, there is also talking about the role of government and statecraft. There is also the opportunity there, and for the US, I guess, to incentivize companies to shorten their supply chain. But I agree with Robert fundamentally. I think that from in the next 10 to 20 years, all the supply chain will be back in near to the big power, and China will be out of the picture. So yeah, but I do think that there is opportunity for Latin America there. So I hope that the region will be able to really make the most of it.
I want to pick up some of the questions from the audience now. If anyone wants to ask a question vocally, then please click the button to raise your hand and I will come to you. But first of all, we have a few written questions, and the first I'll pick up on is on exactly this topic of sort of decoupling. And although you expect the US to continue its own policy of decoupling, do you expect it to continue putting pressure on other countries to do the same, particularly Europe and particularly, for example, on the issue of 5G and other technologies? David?
Yeah, so I think on 5G, the answer to that question is definitely yes. I think I think what you're going to actually see from a Biden administration is a continuity in terms of both the substance of the security-based desire to limit the role of Chinese entities in the 5G build out, that there'll be a continuity in pressure on third countries. I think what the difference is going to be is I suspect a Biden administration to be much more proactive in seeking to create some form of multilateral coalition of the willing public-private partnership in support of creating a viable commercial alternative to Huawei for 5G. So this was always the problem. The Trump administration, you can't go with Huawei, but then who do you go with? Because existing organizations do not have the capacity and scale to really engage in this build out. So I think that will change. Now, I'm not a believer that decoupling goes everywhere, even in the tech space. I think and I certainly don't believe that China gets cut off in any way from global finance or from global supply chains. I think that the trend on supply chains is not reshoring as much as it is creating resilience by partial deshoring from China. And I agree with Irene, that's a big opportunity for the Latin American countries. But I don't think that we're going to necessarily see a bifurcation of the world economy, although in some elements of tech we are. I mean, right now, the fact of the matter is that money is pouring into China from all over the world, including the United States, as part of this global search for any ability to earn money, given how low interest rates are. And that world isn't going to change very soon. So China can't disappear. China is going to be an ever-growing financial factor in the world. So I think we got to be careful with the decoupling notion, because I remain a skeptic about generalized decoupling.
Aside from China, where else do you think capital will be flowing in search of better returns?
Well, Southeast Asia, for certain. So, one might think India, but generally not, although individual Indian states probably yes. We'll see if Africa can play that kind of a role. Uncertain right now. I do believe that once the U.S. begins to recover, there's going to be a huge flow of capital back into the United States.
Nick, can I just add something to David's point, just on India, because it's so important strategically in the Pacific, as we know. The US, Japan, European countries have their Indo-Pacific strategies or concepts or visions, or whatever you like to call them. But India itself, despite its sort of strategic importance, is in a state. Its economy, minus 10% this year. The previous year, it was already slowing because of various sort of domestic headwinds and so on. And of course, you've got RCEP potentially going to be an agreement in the next few days. And India, I would assume, would stand outside that. So you have an economy that's not competitive, that's quite closed, where you've got lots of, you've got debt issues, you've got difficulties creating jobs for the youngsters coming into the jobs market. At the same time as you've got Asia coalescing into various trade blocks. So you've got ASEAN already, and you've got CPTPP we've talked about, RCEP, and so on. And India is sort of very much on its own. So India, I think, you know, I'm sort of perennially hopeful for India, because I like the idea of this enormous democracy that's that every time it votes is a sort of living miracle. I like that, but actually, I think India is going to be struggling for a few years yet, until it starts to reform and really unleash the potential of its economy.
Yeah, I think Robert's exactly right about that. I mean, it's not very long ago where the expectation was that India structurally is going to have a higher growth rate than China. That was the just enormously widely held expectation, and gee, it does not look that way now.
I want to pick up on another couple of questions that have been written. Two questions that relate to climate. So the first of these questions concerns the US and China. There is a perception that you can't, in the US, do anything on climate change unless you bring China to agree with you, says Maurizio Bragagni. While China remains the world's worst polluter, what would be the best approach for the US? And then there's a question I'll direct at Irene. Do you think Biden will be tougher on Bolsonaro for his rainforest policies? How might that tougher attitude be shown? So firstly, David, and then I'll come to Irene.
Yeah, so China and climate. So it certainly has always been the case in the US that there has been a political linkage in the US between US commitments and Chinese commitments. And I agree with the question that I don't think that linkage goes away. When you talk to the Biden advisors, they are, when you ask them, okay, so what are you going to cooperate with China on? Without exception, the first issue that comes out of their mouths is climate change. And again, I think there's definitely the aspiration to do that. But just as I'm a little bit skeptical about how easy it is going to be to do trade deals between the Biden administration and China, I have a very similar viewpoint on climate. And a lot of this is going to depend on, can and will Biden be able to create a different relationship with Xi Jinping? And I mean, the senior Chinese, both officials and observers whom I've talked to in the past 6 months, all seem to agree that they don't see a lot of difference between Biden and Trump once you get beyond the superficial things. Clearly, they see Biden as being more predictable, but their view is that the US has turned against them, and that doing anything with the Americans is not going to be easy to do and can only be done from a position of Chinese strength. And, you know, that's not a set of assumptions that makes for an easy going. So I envision the first year or two of a Biden administration of having a lot in common with what happened during the first year or two of the Obama administration, where there were all of these expectations of doing these very big deals with China, none of which came to pass, and relations ended up being pretty competitive and somewhat conflictual. I don't think we're out of that world. I think that's the world we're in.
Irene, Biden and Bolsonaro.
My favorite topic. So, yeah, I mean, judging from what Bolsonaro said yesterday about Biden, he said that some, without referring to Trump, but to Biden, but he did say that with some policymaker in the US, you had to deal with gunpowder. So, I mean, I'm not sure is going to be much more inclined to listen to it, but I do think we'll have to listen to it, because obviously, you know, the US can use very kind of classic tool of statecrafts on Brazil, including trade and investment. But not only the US, I think there is actually a momentum around the world against this Bolsonaro treatment of the Amazons. I guess there is the issue in terms of Mercosur. Some countries in Europe have actually cast doubt on the fact of going ahead with a trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur, unless the environmental standards are maintained. Also, investors and corporate in the corporate world have made quite clear that, you know, it's protecting the Amazons is part of the deal. So I think Bolsonaro also at the same time is, you know, he may look like Trump, but I think he's probably a bit more pragmatic than Trump. And in the past as well, he has shown that he can moderate his discourse whenever it's needed. The reality is that Brazil, very similar to India, it's always been the country of the future, and it continues to be a country of the future. So there are very important structural weaknesses that need to be addressed in Brazil, having to do obviously with you know, structural reforms, which some of them have started under Bolsonaro, but I guess that my outlook on that is not very optimistic. I don't think there are going to be in the 2 years that stay there maybe those kind of reforms. So we'll have to actually listen to what the international community and the international investor have to say. So I do think, you know, Biden has proposed 20 billion aid for the Amazons, to which Bolsonaro has said no. But I do think he will have to listen to what Biden and the rest of the world say on that.
And if economic carrots don't work, David, do you think there would ever be any appetite for economic sticks to push foreign governments to pursue more climate-friendly or rainforest-friendly policies?
So this is definitely one of the ideas that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is bringing into the foreign policy debate. When I look at a Biden administration, I think on domestic issues, there's going to be a really strong tug and pull between progressives and moderates. But on foreign policy, I think that the Biden team is still a pretty traditional team. So I really find it hard to believe that that push will come to shove vis-a-vis Brazil under a Biden administration. I think that this is going to be a big challenge, because you have these two populist leaders in Latin America, you know, Lopez Obrador and Bolsonaro. And Lopez Obrador, just as he was amenable for doing deals with Trump, will be amenable for doing deals with Biden. Bolsonaro, he dances to a different tune. So I think that there's not going to be a close relationship between Biden and Bolsonaro, but I don't think the U.S. is going to put itself out there in opposition to Bolsonaro.
Well, we've almost come to the end of our time, but I'm going to squeeze in one more question that's been asked. Another one that's hard to avoid. What, Robert, are the prospects for a US-UK trade deal now we are likely to have? Well, looks like we have a Biden administration.
Well, obviously the government would love to be able to deliver that. The Japan-UK trade deal, EPA, looks like it'll start in the beginning of 2021. US-UK deal would be good for the UK government politically. I suspect it's going to be rather more difficult. Well, as the government obviously knows, the UK government, it will be difficult, partly because of what the US will want to extract in return for this deal, which would be concessions on financial services, on pharmaceuticals, and so on, agriculture as well, chlorinated chicken. Being the sort of the best known example of political football around this deal. Biden may also get caught up in Brexit discussions, largely with regard to what happens with Northern Ireland and what the impact of political decisions in Westminster around Brexit that might have an impact on Northern Ireland. Biden, of course, famously hails from Ireland. Originally, his family comes from there, so he has specific views on this, and he won't take kindly to anything that means that Ireland is, as the island of Ireland, is put in a difficult position. So I think the UK government will sort of have to navigate the Brexit discussions with the EU. I think it's now Biden is in charge, a US-UK deal looks a bit more difficult, I would say, which may mean that the UK government is more favourable towards a deal with the EU. Obviously, they're in the tunnel now, just negotiating hard as we speak. So, if we're going to sort of think about where the UK might go now that it's left the EU, one thing to watch in addition would be does the UK manage to join the CPTPP? There are hurdles to this, not least some of the chapters in the CPTPP that might be difficult for the UK to accept. But I think this is one that I'm certainly following very closely, less because of the trade impact, because trade is about geographical proximity in the first instance, and these countries are in the CPTPP a long way away, but more because of the sign of political intent, particularly with regard to the Indo-Pacific.
You mentioned some of the obstacles and pitfalls to a US-UK trade deal, but where are the areas for mutual benefit? And do you think it would include financial services?
Well, the US will be looking at the UK financial services sector. You're one of the most competitive in the UK. The UK has, and will want some of it, but they'll also want a bigger share for their players in it as well. So, given the asymmetry of size between the UK and the US, I mean, this is something that the UK will increasingly have to navigate as it strikes its, as it makes its way in a sort of post-EU world. It's quite difficult for the UK, I think, to have leverage there because it hasn't got the EU, the weight of the EU behind it. But I think any deal, I mean, the US will drive a hard bargain, and it'll be a matter of a question of trade-offs, as these deals always are. But for the UK government, the key, financial services is really important. Healthcare now has become politically important, as it has done, as it is now everywhere. And of course, the other one, which is emotionally important, is agriculture. And this, if you look at France, the French agriculture sector has a political clout well in excess of its economic contribution, as do agriculture sectors in pretty much every single country. So it's a very difficult one to navigate this, I think, for the UK government in particular. The US, of course, would presumably like a deal, but it's less critical for the US than it is for the UK.
David.
Yeah, I think that Robert's last point is really important. I think that the U.S. would like to do a deal, but it's not going to be anywhere near the top of its priority on the trade side and early on. So I would say 2022.
Well, Robert, David, Irene, thank you very much. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Apologies to the audience that we've run 5 minutes over, but I hope you appreciated the conversation that we've had. Before we wrap up, I just want to flag a couple of upcoming events. Next Friday, on the 20th of November at 1 p.m. UK time, we will be launching the Strategic Survey, our annual review of world geopolitics. And the following Monday, on the 23rd of November at 4 p.m. UK time, Irene is hosting an event on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, asking whether it's achievable after the pandemic, with speakers from the UN Capital Development Fund, the ICRC, and the International Organization of Employers. Please feel free to join us for either of those events and just check back on our website for any others you might like to participate in. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully you'll join us again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very much, Nick. Excellent job.